We broke down the door with a crowbar, got my mother-in-law out of a $70,000 scam, and in return we heard that we were cursed. She is still waiting for her favorite doctor from Boston. A story that surpassed all the series. It all started with a suspicious silence, the kind that doesn't feel like peace but more like the air just before a storm you can't yet see. We had always known my mother-in-law, Marcia, lived modestly in a quiet little town in Texas, a place where everyone knew everyone and word traveled faster than the wind. My wife, Rachel, had always done more than her part as a daughter. Every month without fail, she sent Marcia $700 to help with expenses, even when it meant tightening our own budget. And that wasn't all. She paid to have the plumbing redone, replaced the roof after a storm, and completely renovated her mother's kitchen and bathroom last year. It wasn't just generosity. It was love. It was guilt. It was obligation wrapped up in the complicated history they never fully talked about. But Marcia kept asking for more. Not directly, not always with words, but with sighs and passive-aggressive comments on the phone, hints about the neighbors going on vacation or how her old car might just give out any day now. And when she did ask, it was always with this tone of wounded expectation, like anything less than full financial devotion was neglect. Rachel, who has the kindest heart I've ever known, rarely said no even when she should have. The turning point came not from what Marcia said to us, but what she said to everyone else. We started hearing things through back channels, casual conversations with distant relatives, awkward comments at weddings, whispers that Marcia had been telling people we weren't helping her at all, that we'd left her to struggle, that Rachel, her only daughter, had forgotten where she came from. At first, we thought it had to be a misunderstanding. But the more we listened, the more clear it became. She wasn't just venting. She was painting us as the villains in a story we had been financing from the start. And that silence, the one that had settled over the past few weeks, the one Rachel tried to explain away, suddenly didn't feel like distance. It felt like calculation. Then the rumors started, creeping into our lives through unexpected phone calls and awkward conversations, the kind that begin with a hesitant, "I don't want to interfere, but," and end with a warning you can't unhear. Relatives we barely spoke to and old friends from Rachel's childhood began reaching out, their voices low, cautious, almost apologetic. They told us that Marcia was trying to mortgage her land and had even gone as far as putting her house up for sale, the very house we had helped renovate, the house we thought she wanted to grow old in. But it didn't stop there. What shook us most was the fact that she was allegedly listing the property not just as her own, but including Rachel's two half-sisters and their children in the documents, as if she had the right to uproot entire lives for a financial move no one else had agreed to. It sounded surreal at first, too bizarre to be real, and Rachel refused to believe it. She kept saying, "There's no way she'd do that without talking to me," her voice somewhere between panic and denial. But the calls kept coming, the stories began to overlap, and what once seemed like gossip started to take the shape of something much more serious. People were warning us not just out of concern, but with urgency, as if they knew this wasn't just a rumor but a fuse that had already been lit. And through it all, Marcia remained silent, saying nothing to us, pretending everything was normal while behind the scenes it looked like she was preparing to blow it all up. After we started digging into what was really going on, what began as scattered warnings and rumors quickly turned into something far more serious, something we couldn't ignore. With every phone call, every document we managed to get our hands on, and every uneasy conversation Rachel had with distant family members, the truth began to piece itself together like a puzzle we didn't want to solve. Marcia had fallen for the scam again. It wasn't the first time, and deep down, I think Rachel had feared it from the beginning but didn't want to believe her mother could let it happen twice. The first time had been years ago, a painful chapter we all tried to forget, when Marcia had lost close to $25,000 wiring money to a man she had met online, someone who promised her love, companionship, and a life together that never existed. It had left Rachel devastated and furious, not just because of the money, but because of how manipulated and vulnerable her mother had become. But this time it was worse. So much worse. We learned that the amount she had already sent to this new scammer was nearly $70,000, drained slowly over months through secret transfers, payday loans, and gifts she'd pawned. And what chilled us was what she was trying to do next. She wasn't just selling trinkets or asking for help. She was in the process of trying to sell her home and mortgage family land, valued at over $500,000, all because someone on the other side of a screen had convinced her that love and salvation came with a wire transfer. Rachel sat in silence when we confirmed it, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes wide with a mix of heartbreak and disbelief. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a collapse. And the woman who claimed we weren't doing enough had been quietly tearing her own life apart for a fantasy that was never real. We decided to act because sitting on the sidelines while everything fell apart was no longer an option. 3 weeks after confirming the extent of the scam and realizing just how far Marcia was willing to go, we booked tickets and flew to Texas with a sense of urgency that neither of us had ever felt before. It wasn't just about saving money or property anymore, it was about pulling her out of a dangerous spiral before she destroyed everything, including the lives of the people who depended on her. I took it upon myself to organize what I hoped would be an intervention, not just with words but with presence, with enough voices in the room to break through whatever illusion she was trapped in. I called relatives from both sides of the family, some of whom we hadn't spoken to in years, and explained the situation. I told them the truth, about the money, the scam, the house, and the danger Marcia was in. To my surprise, many of them agreed to help. We planned to meet at her house on a Sunday afternoon. 10 people, each prepared to speak plainly and gently, to show her she wasn't alone but also to make her understand that this could not continue. But when we arrived, she was gone. The door was locked, the blinds drawn, and her car wasn't in the driveway. We knocked. We called. We waited. Nothing. A neighbor told us they hadn't seen her for 2 days. The family started calling every number we could think of, checking hospitals, friends, even motels nearby. And just like that, the intervention we had spent weeks building collapsed before it even began. She had disappeared, and with her, the last fragile thread of control we thought we had. We found her 2 days later at a ranch outside the city, a quiet, aging property that had once belonged to an old family friend and now sat mostly abandoned, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by rusted fencing. Someone had spotted her car parked near the back, half hidden behind an old shed, and when we drove out there with Rachel's uncle and a cousin, none of us really knew what we were going to find. We knocked on the door, called her name, pleaded through the wooden panels for her to come out, but she wouldn't answer. Through the blinds we could see lights flickering, movement, shadows, but the door stayed locked. Then from inside we heard her screaming, not words at first, just panic, a wild, animal-like fear. When she finally did speak, it was terrifying. She shouted that we were trying to kill her, that we had come to steal everything from her, that the man she loved had warned her this would happen. Her voice cracked and twisted, and she sounded nothing like the sharp, composed woman I had known, not even like the difficult mother Rachel had grown up with, but like someone lost entirely in a world that didn't exist. We stood there stunned, unsure if she was having a breakdown or if something even worse had happened. When the shouting turned to silence, we broke the door open with a crowbar. It splintered inward with a sickening crack, and inside we found her standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by torn papers, unopened bills, and empty food containers. Her eyes were wild, sunken, darting from face to face like she didn't recognize a single one of us. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes stained, and in that moment, all the anger I had felt drained away, replaced by something heavier, grief. She wasn't fighting us. She wasn't resisting us. She was broken. A confused, frightened woman who had wrapped her entire sense of reality around a fantasy, and we had finally torn it down. I tried to reach her the only way I knew how, through patience, through truth, through sitting beside her on that dusty couch for 5 long hours and refusing to walk away. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just talked to her gently, like someone slowly untangling a knot that's been tightening for far too long. I explained how these fraudsters operate, how they find vulnerable people, how they say just the right things to make you feel seen, needed, even loved. I showed her screenshots, printouts, bank records, and messages that Rachel and I had pieced together like a map leading directly to the betrayal. For the longest time she said nothing. Her face stayed blank, unreadable, her eyes flicking over the pages like she was looking at something in a language she didn't understand. But I could tell she was listening. She wasn't yelling anymore. She wasn't insisting on her version of reality. She was just sitting there, silent but present, absorbing the truth as it unfolded in front of her. And then, without warning, something in her cracked. Her shoulders sagged, her lip trembled, and she looked at me, not like someone angry or defensive, but like someone waking up from a dream that had turned into a nightmare. She started to cry. Not loud sobs, but the kind of quiet, shaking tears that come when the denial finally collapses. She whispered, "I didn't want to believe it, but I do. I believe you." And in that moment, it wasn't a victory. It was heartbreak. Because what we had torn away from her wasn't just a lie, it was the only thing she had left that made her feel loved. We hugged each other there in that dim, cluttered living room, all of us crying, not out of relief exactly, but out of the sheer weight of everything that had finally come to the surface. Rachel clung to her mother like she hadn't in years, and Marcia, still shaking, wrapped her arms around her daughter as if she had just realized what she almost lost. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, it felt like we had brought her back to reality, pulled her out of the fog and reminded her of who she really was and who still cared about her when the illusion crumbled. She agreed to stay the night at the ranch, too exhausted and emotionally drained to leave, and we didn't argue. It felt safer that way, away from the noise of the town, from the phone, from temptation. As we made up a bed for her in the back room, she promised she wouldn't contact Dr. Kevin again, said his name like she knew now just how absurd it was, how much power she had given to someone who didn't even exist. She said she would give us her phone in the morning, and for the first time, it didn't sound like avoidance. It sounded like surrender. A soft, broken kind of surrender, but real. That night, we sat outside under the stars for a long time without speaking much, all of us too tired to say anything that hadn't already been said. But for the first time in a long time there was quiet. Not the dangerous kind, not the silence that hides secrets, but the kind that comes when a storm passes, and you're just grateful everything is still standing. But she lied. A few days later, when the dust had settled and we all let ourselves believe things were finally turning around, we sat down together for a quiet family dinner at Rachel's cousin's house. It was one of those evenings meant to feel normal again. Simple food, familiar faces, and a soft effort to remind Marcia she was loved outside of fantasy. For a little while it worked. She smiled, she listened, she passed dishes across the table with a steadiness that almost felt like the old her. We were careful not to bring up anything too heavy, trying not to push too hard too soon. But then, after a pause in the conversation, I looked across the table and asked her gently, "You don't believe in Kevin anymore, do you?" I expected a sigh, a nod, maybe even a quiet confirmation that she had let him go for good. But instead, she looked me dead in the eyes, her fork resting still on her plate, and said with a strange calmness, "I don't know what you mean." There was no Kevin. The room went silent. Rachel's hand stiffened in mine, and I felt the air shift, like the floor beneath us had just cracked open again. It wasn't confusion in Marcia's voice. It was denial, cold, deliberate, and practiced. Like we had imagined it all. Like the man who drained her life savings, the lies, the breakdown, the tears, the ranch. None of it had ever happened. She sat there with a smile so distant it chilled me, as if erasing the truth was easier than living in it. And in that moment, I realized she hadn't come back from that place. Not really. She had only learned how to wear the right mask again. Chaos broke out so quickly it felt like the entire evening imploded in a matter of seconds. As soon as Marcia uttered those words, denying the existence of Kevin like the last few weeks had been some shared delusion, my daughter, who had been quiet all dinner, clearly simmering, stood up without saying a word, reached into her backpack and threw a stack of printouts onto the table. They slid across the wood, fanning out like evidence in a courtroom, each page showing screenshots of the messages Marcia had exchanged with the man who claimed to love her, who called her his queen, who had taken $70,000 and nearly her home. The sound of the papers hitting the table echoed in the sudden silence, and for a moment, Marcia just stared at them. We all did. Her denial had cracked something in the room, something raw and unspoken that we had all been holding in. We tried to stay calm, God, we tried, but it was like watching a dam finally give way. Everyone was angry, not yelling exactly, but seething with frustration. There was a pressure in the air, like every breath came with heat. Marcia picked up one of the pages and said it was fake, forged, some trick we had created to confuse her. And when we asked again, gently but firmly, for her to hand over her phone, she clutched it tighter, shaking her head, repeating that we were trying to control her. And then Rachel stood up. She didn't raise her voice or threaten. She simply reached over the table, eyes blazing with tears she refused to let fall, and snatched the phone from her mother's hands. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was desperation. A final attempt to save the last piece of what hadn't yet been lost. Marcia gasped, like her trust had just been violated, but Rachel didn't flinch. She held the phone tight, like it was the only way to pull her mother back to reality before it was too late. We read everything. Sitting there at the table with the air still heavy from the confrontation, we unlocked the phone and went through every message, every email, every photo Marcia had so desperately tried to protect. What we found was worse than we expected, layers upon layers of lies that were so transparently false it would have been almost laughable if they hadn't caused so much pain. There were fake stories about sudden inheritances, promises of first-class flights that never materialized, and screenshots of airline tickets that were clearly doctored, full of mismatched dates and misspelled names. The photos he had sent her were all grainy and awkwardly cropped, pulled straight from the internet with reverse image search results confirming they belonged to someone entirely different. But what broke Rachel the most was a message exchange from just a few weeks ago. Marcia had asked him, politely, hesitantly, why he couldn't just go to the embassy for a visa like he'd promised. And his reply, blunt and dismissive, read, "There is no American embassy in Germany." It was so absurd, so ignorant, so impossible to believe that it should have shattered the illusion on the spot. But instead, Marcia had responded with a heart emoji and a message saying she trusted him. That moment crushed something in all of us, not because of the stupidity of the lie, but because it showed how deeply she had surrendered her logic, her dignity, and even her common sense to this fantasy. It wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was devotion to a delusion. And sitting there, reading those words out loud, we finally understood how far gone she really was. Marcia still believed. Even after we showed her everything, the fake photos, the absurd messages, the contradictions so glaring they practically screamed scam, she clung to her illusion with a grip that bordered on delusional. When we confronted her about the embassy message, expecting embarrassment or at least acknowledgement of how ridiculous it was, she didn't even blink. Instead, she said softly, almost like she was confiding in us, "I just didn't want him to be in trouble. Maybe he really didn't know. I should have told him where the embassy is." There was no sarcasm, no trace of irony, just this heartbreaking sincerity in her voice, as if we were the ones missing something. She looked at us not like a woman caught in a lie, but like someone trying to protect a fragile truth no one else could see. It wasn't stubbornness anymore. It was full denial of reality. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She genuinely thought she could help him, that maybe with the right information, something as basic as an embassy address, she could ease whatever imaginary hardship he was going through. Rachel buried her face in her hands, and I just sat there speechless, realizing that we hadn't pulled her back at all. We had only peeled away the top layer. Underneath, Marcia still lived in that world, still believed that Kevin was real, and still believed that somehow, all of this was just a misunderstanding she could fix with love and loyalty. And that, in a way, was the most devastating part of all. We sat down the next day and began to calculate the full extent of the damage, not just emotionally but financially, and the numbers were staggering. Altogether, Marcia had lost around $70,000. Most of it quietly, bit by bit, over months that she had spent building a relationship with a man who never existed. It was spread across everything she could liquidate: the land she inherited from her parents, which she sold far below market value in a desperate rush for fast cash; the used car she had driven for over a decade, traded in for pennies; the jewelry Rachel remembered from her childhood, pawned without hesitation; and the stacks of cash she withdrew in secret, sometimes hundreds at a time, until her savings were almost entirely gone. What stunned us most, though, was learning how far she had tried to go. She had even begun the process of mortgaging the small house that once belonged to her ex-husband. The same house Rachel had spent part of her teenage years in, telling the bank that she needed funds for urgent home repairs. But something in the paperwork had stalled, either a missing signature or a red flag in her credit history, and the transaction was never finalized. It was a narrow escape, a financial disaster narrowly avoided not because she stopped herself, but because the system happened to fail her in just the right way. Looking at the spreadsheet we pieced together line by line, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the erosion of her trust, her stability, her dignity. She hadn't just given up assets. She had emptied the foundation of her life for someone who never cared, never existed, and never even tried to pretend well. And somehow, even with all of that staring her in the face, part of her still couldn't let go. Then she put a curse on us. Not figuratively, not some bitter remark muttered under her breath or a dramatic glare over her shoulder. No, she did it seriously, with the conviction of someone who truly believed in what she was doing. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set and the tension in the house had settled into a heavy, uneasy quiet, Marcia walked through the living room without saying a word, opened every window in the house one by one, and began lighting sticks of incense she pulled from a carved wooden box none of us had seen before. At first, we thought she was just trying to clear the air or maybe calm herself, but then she began chanting, low, rhythmic, deliberate, reading from a wrinkled stack of printed papers filled with strange phrases and unfamiliar symbols. Her voice echoed through the rooms as she called out names we didn't recognize, whispering then shouting, invoking something she described as a force that would balance the pain we had caused her by tearing away her only real love. Rachel stood frozen in the hallway, eyes wide with disbelief, while I sat motionless on the edge of the couch, trying to process the fact that this woman, Rachel's mother, was calling down harm on her own family. She waved the incense like a weapon, smoke curling through the house as she cursed us by name, swearing that we would suffer as she had suffered, that our lives would unravel for breaking apart what she still insisted was sacred. It was surreal, disturbing, and more than anything heartbreaking. Not because I believed in the curse, but because I finally understood just how far gone she really was. We hadn't just lost Marcia to a scam. We had lost her completely. We saved the property anyway, though it came at a cost we never anticipated when this all began. Rachel made the decision without hesitation. She sold her wedding jewelry, every piece, the rings and heirlooms she had once cherished, quietly wrapping them in tissue paper and taking them to a trusted buyer without a single complaint. I sold my car, the one we had worked so hard to pay off, the one we used on road trips and late-night drives when we needed to clear our heads. Between those two sacrifices, and with some help from her sister who had also been blindsided by their mother's unraveling, we scraped together just enough to buy back 2 of the fields Marcia had hastily sold in desperation. The titles are now in Rachel and her sister's names, a quiet but firm statement that from this point forward, the family legacy would be protected by the ones still grounded in reality. It wasn't just about land. It was about reclaiming something their mother had tried to throw away, a connection to their past, to the place they had once belonged to before it was tangled in lies and manipulation. But Marcia remained in her illusions. She didn't thank them. She didn't acknowledge what we had done. She still spoke of Kevin in cryptic fragments, hinting at his return, insisting that love like theirs could not be broken by those who don't understand. She drifted through the days in that house like a ghost clinging to a dream, untouched by the truth we had tried so hard to give her. And despite everything we managed to recover, there was no saving the version of her we once knew. She had chosen her illusion. We had chosen to move forward without it. We cut off contact. After months of chasing shadows, sleepless nights, financial damage, and emotional wounds that still haven't fully healed, we finally made the hardest decision of all. We severed every line she could use to hurt herself or anyone else. We disconnected her phones, stopped all money transfers, and left her with nothing but the basic utility bill to keep the lights on and the water running. No more cash to wire to strangers. No more fake names in her inbox. No more open doors for her to walk through and sabotage what was left. Now she wanders from house to house, knocking on the doors of neighbors and distant relatives, asking for help, for sympathy, for money. She tells them that we abandoned her, that her daughters betrayed her, that the man she loved was stolen from her by a jealous family who never understood. And some people, not knowing the full story, give her a few dollars out of pity, while others politely turn her away, having heard just enough to know she's no longer living in the world the rest of us occupy. But at least now she cannot lose anything else of real value. The land is safe. The house cannot be mortgaged. Her daughters' futures are no longer at risk. All she has left are the stories she tells and the ashes of a fantasy that cost her everything. And perhaps the saddest part is that the only thing she continues to sacrifice is her dignity, a dignity she gave away long ago for the hollow promises of a man who never existed. In the end, we couldn't save her from that choice. But we saved everything else. And that will have to be enough.